According to the main character, people can be divided into 3 different groups: heroes, ordinary people, and villains. However, not all heroes are famous personalities, and ordinary people are not always completely normal. Likewise, it is impossible to say that someone is definitely a bad person just because he is a villain, although, obviously, there will always be those who agree with this stereotype. If you ask which group a guy belongs to, without any doubt the young man will answer that he is a villain. Suddenly, a bright flash of light hit the eyes of the blonde young man, who woke up in a strange place. 2 more people woke up next to him, who also did not understand how they ended up here. Suddenly, the 4th person told everyone that there was no need to be nervous, they should calm down, everyone should control themselves. But the blonde yelled at the 4th, and reproached him for being too calm. The fierce young man pounced on the ladder and, grabbing him by the shirt, began to shake him roughly. The girl standing nearby was horrified by what she saw, and the young man next to her tensed. But the guy in the suit, whom the blonde attacked, did not leave it like that. The young man grabbed the enemy by the arms and kicked him in the stomach from his knee. The fair-haired man doubled over in pain and called the young man in classic clothes names, but he was in no mood to be hostile and extended his hand to him. The young man introduced himself as Ken. He also did not understand what was happening here, and explained that, like everyone else, he had just woken up, so he asked the fair-haired man to dispense with baseless speculation. But the guy with blonde hair waved his hand away and started shouting at Ken what kind of nonsense he was talking about, telling them what to believe and what not to believe. One of those present introduced himself as Scott. The girl standing nearby decided to follow the guy's example and also introduced herself. Her name was Meg. The blonde calmed down a little and also decided to introduce himself as Peter. Suddenly, a blue holographic screen appeared in front of the group of people gathered. All people began to wonder if what was happening was real. Peter thought that perhaps he had drunk too much yesterday. Meg asked the guys if each of them saw a window in front of them that said about the task. Ken didn't understand, but suggested everyone discuss it. The blonde man was again angry with the guy in classic clothes for showing his leadership character, but Meg asked Peter not to argue, but to analyze the situation. But the blonde man once again tried to be sarcastic. Finally, Scott joined the guys. He also asked Peter to be quieter, but the blonde found something to answer. Scott pointed his finger forward somewhere. There was a broken door, from which a zombie suddenly appeared. Peter and Meg saw the dead man and screamed loudly. The task stated that a group of people would need to survive, destroy or escape while people possessed by evil spirits were chasing them. Peter and Meg screamed again, and Ken asked them to calm down. Each of the options for completing the task had its own special conditions. The guy in classic clothes asked not to panic in such a situation, but Peter did not understand how he could not panic when this was happening here. Someone present suggests blocking the door first, but they don't have time. The zombie breaks through it and flies into the room where a group of people have gathered. Ken punched the zombie's mouth with all his might. The young man in the suit realizes that this monster is quite weak. Ken ordered the others to grab something, because there was only one zombie and the guys could kill him if they attacked all together. Meg and Peter came to their senses and began to look for something they needed nearby. At this moment, the actions in the room were recorded on camera. One of the guards approached the other and asked if the latest training had begun, and he answered yes. The first one noticed that these people were quite unusual. The man looked around the group of people. 3 of them tried to resist the monster, but the 4th stood aside. The old man noticed that he couldn't say for sure, as he had just approached, but he noted that it all started too quickly, and the second observer suggested paying attention to the blonde. The guy's name was Peter, and the warden noticed that the guy was the first to wake up before everyone else and figure out the system. However, after that he pretended that he was still unconscious, like everyone else. The blonde did not tell anyone about the existence of the system, as well as about the status window with the window of abilities. The old man was surprised that the guy even understood this first. The second warden thought it was funny and laughed, and thought Peter himself was cunning. The first observer noted that Ken also surprised him. He had the skill from the very beginning. The supervisor said that this is not uncommon, but the problem is that the guy's ability is high rank. It is incredibly rare for someone to have a skill with a mastery of this rank right from the start. The guard added that thanks to Ken, everyone was able to get together and start acting, even though there was a possessed spirit with the ability to intimidate. The old man asked the second one if this was their first time undergoing training. Suddenly the guards noticed something strange. The second observer noted that this action of the participant was quite unexpected. The cattle stabbed a sharpened wooden board into Ken's neck. Maintaining a calm expression, the guy explained his action by saying that no matter how much he thought, it seemed to him that this was the only way to survive here. Meg fell into madness. She grabbed her head and screamed with all her might. The girl endlessly repeated that this was all just a nightmare, just a bad dream, and she herself was just sleeping. But meanwhile Scott, with a piece of wood in his hands, was already heading towards Meg to kill her too. A couple of moments later, the guy finished with the girl too, leaving bloody footprints behind him. And so Scott went to the last player he intended to kill. The noisiest of all, Peter, now stood silently and looked at Scott in horror. The blonde didn't understand until recently what that guy was up to and who he was. Some time later, Scott was done with the fair-haired one. The system issued a message with congratulations and completion of the training task, and the holographic screen showed the guy's new characteristics. The system added that the guy was chosen as a participant in the great game in order to choose the next successor to the god. Suddenly someone turned to Scott. The guy turned towards the voice that sounded. A handsome young man with white hair and a white suit bowed in front of him. He introduced himself as Jerry and explained that this was the starting room, and he was Scott's assistant. Jerry said that this world is a huge stage created by the Celestials to choose a new successor to a god, and the point is that the longer you survive in this world, the higher the chances of being chosen as the successor of a high-ranking god. Scott began to think that the status window and this guy Jerry who appeared were judging that this was not the world that the young man knew. The young man noted that the beginning was just like an ordinary short story. The assistant agreed with a smile that this was exactly the case. If the guy had played games before, then all this would seem familiar to him. But Jerry added that although it is similar to the games, there is a small detail that death here is real, and the only way to leave this world is to die or become a god. Scott mentally noted with displeasure that he could not return alive. The assistant, seeing the guy's excitement, explained that he should not worry, because he can be reborn once if he dies, therefore, he has 2 lives. The guy himself thought that it was shameless of Jerry to say not to worry, but if there are actually 2 lives, then the 3 who are in training are also alive. Scott asked if the assistant could heal his arm. The blonde replied that there was no problem. With one snap of his fingers, Jerry healed the young man's injured arm. The title of traitor appeared above Scott's head. The assistant thought what a freak this guy was that he earned such a title of traitor only after finishing his training. But Jerry himself, despite all his speculations, maintained a friendly appearance, while the guy himself was amazed at the miracles of healing. The assistant said that he was giving time to prepare before his actual battle. If the guy looked in his inventory, he would find a training reward that he could use to purchase items or skills that he would use during battles. 3 hours passed, and the guy was not yet ready to end his search. Scott acquired low-rank sword mastery, 3 basic sword techniques and low-rank inventory. Jerry mentally noted that the guy had finally decided to buy inventory, and even one that not everyone could afford, did not deny himself anything. Then the assistant noticed that the young man had bought additional food and camping equipment. Jerry noted that Scott really knew what he would need in the future. The young man added that to all this, he took a magic book, and did not covet a high-rank weapon. This is an excellent choice for completing a mission where survival is more important than ever. Finally, Scott stopped the purchase with the thought that all this should be enough for him. Jerry announced that since the guy had finished his preparations, then for now he would go to the real battle. A dog immediately appeared in front of the guy, and the assistant asked Scott to kill this dog. The guy looked at the dog in horror. The animal continued to look harmlessly at the young man. Jerry explained that if Scott kills this dog, then the real battle will end, and the guy will finally be able to rest. Of course the dog will not resist. The assistant noted that the guy hadn't done this before. Scott thought about it. Because everything is true, he has already killed 3 people anyway. Therefore, the guy realized that nothing had changed and clutched his sword tighter. The young man confidently swung his sword over the dog and killed it. Jerry said that he was glad that the guy was not wasting his time, so he suggested that the young man rest. But at the same moment the young man vomited. The assistant said that, after all, he could understand the guy. Jerry was already anticipating how the guy would begin to beg to return the dog, because this was not surprising. Everything was going too smoothly. And so Scott, with all his strength, grabs the assistant's hand. The guy asks for more in a trembling voice. Jerry clarifies the question because it seemed to him that he had misheard. The young man asks to give him another dog. The assistant only agrees and adds that as much as he wants. Scott realizes this is his chance to practice his skills before the mission. Therefore, the young man killed more than 100 dogs, and then horses, cows and other large animals. And then the guy killed more goblins, ogres and orcs. Hate him the guy. As soon as he more or less got used to the sword, with parting words from Jerry, his mission finally began. Suddenly, several people appeared in an unknown area that looked like a small town. All the people began to panic, wondering what this strange place was. Only Scott was calm and reasonable. He thought that there was no point wasting time. He needed to hurry. Because the world of the mission had already started, the mission had begun, so the guy was sure that somewhere here there was an assistant like Jerry. Before the young man had time to finish his thought, he was greeted by a girl with the same smile as Jerry. She said that Scott was the first visitor to the first city mission station, and called the guy a player. The girl further said that the players cannot leave the city, but they can receive tasks at the checkpoint, and since he is a newbie, but can start with something like a rat invasion, the young man realized that since there are tasks here, then this is really a game, where his life is at stake. Scott thought that even if it was just a game, he had not seen any levels or even hints on how to increase his stats. The guy decided that it would be much more profitable to collect all the extra points in order to increase his stats as quickly as possible. The young man told the stranger that he accepted the task. The girl replied that he had begun a mission to prevent a rat invasion and took the guy to the place of execution. Moving through space, Scott thought that killing a few rats shouldn't take much time. But after some time, the guy realized that the rats were too small and nimble. He couldn't catch them. But he hoped to kill at least one, not to mention 5. In addition, the guy was not told how to exit the quest, which means that he will not be able to get out of here until he completes the mission. The young man noticed that it was not in vain that he bought food in advance. Otherwise, he would have simply died of exhaustion in an attempt to kill the rat. After searching through his inventory, Scott found a low-ranking poison. The guy made bait from his food and poisoned it with the poison found in his inventory. The stranger congratulated the guy on completing the task. The rest of the participants were surprised at how quickly Scott completed the mission. They did not understand how the guy managed to do it so quickly. The young man was infuriated that the girl shouted it all over the street and attracted everyone's attention. But Scott decided to smile. Nothing good would happen if he got angry with the girl. The system announced that he had received the title of traitor to the stone in his bosom. But then other players came up and asked the guy to share information, since he had completed the mission to destroy the rats. But the young man decided that it was worth ignoring the useless irritants. But then the guy changed his mind and asked another player to show his title. He was immediately surprised by the sudden request, but still replied that he was a brave survivor. Scott thought that, judging by the title, this guy could be trusted, and since the young man had received a traitor, he decided to get to know these people better. The young man advises the player not to take this mission, does not recommend taking it on if they lack preparation, but the young man noted that Scott quickly completed it. But other players crowded around here, wanting to find out information and accusing the guy of trying to take the easiest quests for himself. But Scott grinned maliciously, mentally calling people idiots. The players immediately began to take on the same mission of exterminating rats. And the guy asked for a mission to hunt a wolf. The stranger replied that she understood and immediately sent the guy there. Those players who were the first to approach the guy decided to take the mission with insects, although the girl wanted to take the one with rats. The boy was not taken aback and shouted to the departing Scott and offered to join them in a group. The young man added that he had undergone training with his girlfriend, and decided that, judging by those gathered here, it was quite possible to complete the missions as a group. But Scott rejected the offer and added that he hunts alone. The guy was transported to a new space. He began to prepare traps for wolves, and doused his daggers with poison. And finally the enemy appeared. It was a wolf. The young man decided that he would deal with him first. Another wolf appeared and they began to surround the guy. Scott decides to kill the first one with a sword. The wolf's paw falls into the trap set by the guy, and now the young man swung his sword at his enemy. The player dealt a powerful blow, but at that moment the second of the wolves rushed at him. The predatory beast growled and opened its mouth wide, but Scott tried to calm himself down by mentally saying that a wolf is a wolf, even if he is wounded. At the very last moment, the guy was able to block the wolf's attack, and so the young man raised his sword and intended to strike the beast. One moment, and Scott pierced the neck of his enemy with his sword. But at the same moment, a second wolf attacked the guy and bit him hard on the shoulder. The player tried to get the sword from the killed beast, but it didn't work. The guy was not taken aback. He lets go of the sword and jumps. With all his strength, the young man falls back to the ground along with the wolf, crushing the beast to the ground. The cattle takes out the poisoned daggers prepared in advance. The player impales his enemy with this poisonous weapon. Low-class poison arts and low-class trap setting prevent the victim from realizing that the trap is poisonous. Relying on the experience of the rat invasion, the guy was able to achieve the synergy of these two skills, which as a result helped him defeat 30 wolves single-handedly. And the system displayed a message about completing the quest to hunt the infected wolves and receiving a reward. Scott returned to the city, where he was given a task. The girl screamed again that the guy completed the quest before the others, but the young man asked her to be quieter. The stranger said that she was surprised that everything was fine with the guy's body, but just in case, she asked about his well-being. He replied that it didn't matter and asked the girl if she knew where the hotel was. The girl explained that the guy could find her if he found her straight and immediately to the left from the city square. And so Scott found that hotel, but a tall, muscular man blocked his way. The owner asked the guy if he had money and explained that there were a lot of charlatans here who were trying to deceive them, so the guy first asked to show him the money. Scott thought about it and looked for money. The young man took out a huge bag of coins. There were 70,000 in there. The player asked if this was enough, and the owner immediately changed his face from menacing to friendly, and replied that he was more than willing to invite the young man to go inside. The waitress approached the guy and asked what he would like. He asked a counter question. What did they have? The girl replied that whatever he wanted, so the guy ordered what he liked best. Scott called up the status window to see his characteristics. The young man thought about the fact that his indicators had exceeded 10 and were now above average. The level of mastery of his skills had also increased. The guy began to argue that in the early stages everything usually ends faster, or is it because he has a low level of skill? But then those two players noticed Scott and headed towards him. The young man began in a friendly manner that what a coincidence. He did not expect that they would meet again and asked permission to sit next to him. Scott noticed that the heroes were slightly beaten up after the mission, but still allowed them to sit down. The boy asked the hero's name. Scott told them his name. The new acquaintance introduced himself as Greg, and his girlfriend's name was Hannah. Greg thanked the guy that thanks to him, he and the girl didn't get into trouble. Scott was surprised, but his new acquaintance explained to him. The young man thought about the fact that recently he had received information only from the checkpoint and from quests. Greg decided to offer Scott a deal. The new acquaintance explained that he would tell everything he knew, but in return the player would have to buy one portion of food. The young man did not expect such a move from the boy. Scott decided that he saw nothing wrong with listening to useful information, just by buying them a small portion for a few gold pieces. The guy replied that he would feed each of them for 100 gold pieces, so let them tell the story. Those two lit up with joy. Greg began. The first part of his story is that as soon as they finished exterminating the insects, there was a wave of riots throughout the city. The young man continued that people who find themselves in a strange world simply cannot think straight. After a while, soldiers arrived and quelled the unrest. Greg added that those who resisted were taken away. There were those who died. That was the end of it. But the dead were resurrected, which led to even greater chaos. The young man remembered Jerry's words that everyone has two lives. The player continued to tell, now the second part about what is called the penalty for death. Greg explained that after a few minutes, all those resurrected said that their characteristics had decreased by about 3 points. Scott noted that the hero had only 6 characteristics, so it turns out that if you die, you lose 18 points, which is quite a lot. The boy continued that the third part is related to the geography of the area around the city square. There are several stations where you can take quests. These are forges, eateries, hotels and shops, and there is even a place called the Temple of Changing Professions. The guy thought that after hunting he had already received another title. Could he gain even more skills if he tried? And in conclusion, Greg said that he and the girl took a quest to kill insects after Scott's warning, and most of those who went to kill rats did not return. The player replied that this was to be expected. After all, The difficulty in getting through an invasion of rats is not that they are strong, but because they are difficult to kill. And the guy didn't run out of food because he had enough food. And then the guy's order arrived, and Greg and Hannah looked at the food with hungry eyes. Scott suggested to the players that he would buy them food every day if, upon his return, they shared the news with him again. The young man thought that 6,000 gold a month, although this is quite a lot, this way the guy would save time on searching for information. Greg immediately agreed with the young man's proposal. Scott went out into the street, and immediately noticed some people. The players began to ask the guy to show mercy and give them gold. Scott thought that they were all on equal terms. But because of their bad decisions, there are those who fell behind because they could not adapt. These are the beggars. But the guy pushed aside the insolent people who surrounded him, and went about his business. The man whom Scott touched with his shoulder shouted at him that the guy was beating him, even though he was dying of hunger. The young man thought that if there had been some simpleton in his place, he would have already begun to apologize under the pressure of others. And Scott, in the past, was also used to acting so good-naturedly, bowing his head and pacifying his inner demons. But the guy was not an angel from the very beginning, but simply lived, hiding himself under a mask. And this man continued to scream and accuse the guy of hitting him, insulting him along the way. Scott turned to him and answered that if he was hungry, then let him decide this issue himself, and told him not to dare raise his voice if he did not want to die. And the young man left the beggars with a calm expression, because there was no longer any mask, and the man decided not to shout at him anymore. In the morning, the guy showed up at the temple to change his profession. He was greeted by Philip, who was a being created by the great creators to help players. Scott immediately decided to ask Philip something. The guy said that when he opens the status window, it says that he has the profession of a swordsman, a thief and a magician, and he was wondering if there was a difference between the ones that are automatically created and those that can be obtained here. Philip was mentally shocked that only 2 days had passed since the opening of the mission world, and this guy already had 3 professions. The man noted that if you look closely, unlike the others, this young man has a cloak. Philip replied that the professions that the guy has at the moment are temporary and are given depending on the most frequently used weapon. Temporary professions can be replaced at any convenient time. The man added that, however, the professions that a guy can acquire in this temple are permanent, and they cannot be changed. So the player faces a difficult question, because they also increase the characteristics of their characters. The young man asked what these characteristics were. Philip explained that it was better for a guy to see everything for himself once than for a man to have to explain everything 100 times. A large hologram list with various professions appeared in front of Scott. The man said that the Temple of Changing Profession analyzes the entire experience of the player and creates a suitable profession, so it turns out that it will be the most effective for the user, and he will be able to fully realize his potential. The young man clarified that it turns out that the recommended professions are stronger than the standard ones, but the man replied that it is not both. Philip said that the fee for choosing a profession was 50,000 gold and asked if the young man was interested, and added that as long as the guy had money, he could change it as many times as he wanted. Scott thought about the fact that he was confident that he could benefit from this. If we discard those that have their own limitations, then there are 2 professions left, a swordsman and a prudent robber, and the guy liked both options. The system explained that if a guy takes the path of a prudent robber, then he will be forbidden to have insidious thoughts. The young man was interested in this profession, but he did not like the conditions. After all, he was not sure whether he would be able to use traps and poison later, so he thought that this profession would bring him more harm than good, and therefore Scott tells the man that he would like to change his profession to that of a swordsman. Philip asks if the guy has money, because changing his profession will cost 50,000 gold pieces. In response, the young man hands over a bag of coins. The man was shocked for the second time, because there were so many people on the streets suffering from exhaustion because they didn't even have 10 gold coins, so Philip was surprised that there was someone who had already earned 50,000. The man congratulated the guy on entering the path of a swordsman. The system displayed a message about changing his profession to a swordsman, increasing all characteristics by 1, as well as acquiring new skills. Now the guy has the skills of confident gait and boundless aspiration. The young man immediately had questions. The first is forever active or passive, temporary or permanent, and the second skill increased all 18 characteristics and new skills. This will probably be useful to the guy in the future. Returning back, the guy was discussing what effect the active skill of Confident Gate has. Scott wanted to find out as soon as possible, so he hurried. Suddenly the young man noticed something suspicious about him. Some unknown man and woman were watching him, and both were armed. Scott realized that, judging by the equipment, they were experienced fighters. The guy was embarrassed that these two were staring at him because he also had equipment. Suddenly a man grabbed the lady's hand. He looked clearly ill-wisher. He said that their boss wanted to talk to the girl, but she only said in a serious tone to let her go. The bandit asked again, but the girl said even more threateningly that she would not repeat it, so she asked to let her go if the villain did not want to lose his hand. But the man did not listen and continued to swear at the stranger. A second later, the girl fulfilled her promise and cut off the bandit's hand. Scott watched what was happening and the reactions of the other enemies. The bandit, who had lost his arm, screamed. The girl looked at the others and said that they could continue to block her path if they also wanted to remain one-armed. But the villains did not want to repeat the fate of their comrade and began to flee. The system displayed a message about the effect of predisposition, from which the enemy can be filled with a feeling of fear, which can lead him to death through suffocation. Scott felt something like moral pressure. The young man was not sure what it was, but it seems that it does not affect him, since his characteristics increased after changing his profession. A red-haired guy approached Scott and noted that he was quite smart. The player asked him what he meant, but the red-haired man told him not to make a fool of himself, because judging by his clothes and sword, he showed himself well on the training quest, and most likely, he had already changed his profession since he left the temple. But Scott still pretended that he did not understand, and in his thoughts the player suspected that this was another invitation to join. But all that the stranger had was growth, like a gigantic tree. The red-haired man asked the young man to tell him what his title was and said that he was a leader. The guy thought that if he named his title as a traitor, the stranger would immediately become wary. Scott decided to name Greg's title, so he simply answered the red-haired man that there was nothing special about it. So he said that he had the title of a brave survivor. The stranger introduced himself as Kyle and offered to join them, but the young man immediately asked what he would get in return if he agreed. The redhead said that he would receive comrades who could be trusted and financial support. Moreover, Scott would be under the protection of such a strong guy as Kyle, but the young man did not believe in the redhead's strength. Kyle laughed and said that he had 50 strength. Scott was shocked when he heard such a number. Red explained that the powers from the real world transferred into characteristics in this one. As soon as he got here, they considered that strength was his strong point, and Kyle added that if the young man was a smart guy, then his wisdom would be at its best here too. Scott immediately looked at his strength and realized that it did not even exceed 20, and this was after changing his profession, and that guy had it as much as 50. The young man considered this game unfair. The young man asked for forgiveness and refused, adding that it was okay for him to be alone. But the smiling Kyle explained that if the young man changes his mind, then let him come to the birth group, and guaranteed service at the highest level. Scott realized that he needed to complete quests even faster if he wanted to improve his stats. The guy walked up to the quest board and thought that he didn't want to have difficulties with money, so he should get rewards from more difficult quests. Suddenly, the young man and the stranger who deftly dealt with the bandits asked for the same quest to kill orcs. Scott recognized that woman immediately, and so did she. But the stranger repeated the request, and the girl answered, then moves her to the place of the quest. The guy thought that the woman did it on purpose, and was afraid that she might take the bonus for the first passage before him. Therefore, Scott asked Sarah to urgently send him on a quest to kill orcs. When the young man arrived at the new location, he immediately noted the high level of difficulty of the quest. But the young man had no time to reason. He had to hurry. The cattle prepared a trap for the orcs in the form of fried chicken, and he himself disappeared into the bushes. One orc immediately ran up to the food, but the second asked him to wait, because something was wrong. The first orc thought about it, and realized that food in the middle of the forest was very suspicious. The second one agreed with him, and Scott, meanwhile, was mentally glad that the monsters had fallen into a trap. The young man realized that there was no time to waste, because judging by the level of skill, that girl also wanted to get additional stat points. And then a guy jumps out from behind the bushes and summons magic. The orc screamed that there was a man, but Scott told him that everything was right, he was a man. And so the young man struck a blow at the monster, but he repelled it with impressive force. The young man realized that the orcs that Jerry had summoned in the starting room were only his servants, because obviously the real battles would be different, which is why Scott's training did not work against these enemies. The young man began to think about what skill he could use. Meanwhile, the orc had already swung his hand to attack the guy. Scott understood that he would die if he didn't have time to think of anything. Previously, the guy thought that orcs were the stupidest and slowest among all monsters. Scott believed that he could easily resist the two orcs, since they were infected, but even after being shocked, they only staggered. The monster began to shout that the man was a weakling. The young man understood what this would lead to if nothing changed. The orc commanded the younger one to stand, and he would figure it out himself. The younger one replied that he understood, and so the enemy was holding a long machete and was preparing to attack the man. Scott thought that in such a situation he would not be able to use so many skills. Against the orcs, the most effective would be to use the skill of a low-class sword, because other skills would simply crumble from that machete. At the moment, the young man has only 2 active skills. Since the shock does not work, then only one remains. The guy decides to use a confident gait. The orc swings his machete at his opponent with all his might. The young man activates the skill of confident walking, and after activation, Scott decides to strike the monster. The guy pierces the orc's throat with a dagger. The second orc calls out to his fallen older brother. The monster could not believe that this man, who could fall at any moment, killed his brother. And now the mountain turns its gaze to the second orc. The young man again activates the magic of a confident step and flies as fast as he can towards the second orc. The monster noticed that his opponent was staggering. He was sure that he had spent all his strength to block the elder's blow. Therefore, the orc thinks that the tired enemy will not be able to block his attack and swings his club at the guy with all his might. But in the blink of an eye, the guy finds himself behind the monster. The orc turns to the young man and plunges a dagger straight into the heart of the enemy. The monster does not realize what happened for some time, but Scott, looking angrily at the defeated orc, tells him to die. And with these words, the guy blows off his enemy's head in a second. The headless body of the monster is thrown to the ground, and the young man can finally take a breath. The guy realized that he couldn't be too frivolous, because he could lose his life with the slightest mistake. The minimum threshold for completing the quest was killing 3 orcs. The guy could just kill another one and leave, then he would miss the reward. However, the young man just almost died because of 1 orc, so he needs to sensibly assess his strength. Scott realized that he had no desire to fight the enemy face to face, and began to prepare a trap from fishing line. Meanwhile, in the orc settlement, the elder was informed that everyone who went out on patrol did not return back. The elder explained what was happening. The guards reported that a total of 14 fighters were missing. The orc realized that this was definitely the work of human bastards, so he commanded everyone who was capable of fighting to take up arms and get ready. One of the guards explained that most of the orcs had a high temperature due to illness, and they even had difficulty moving. But the elder shouted menacingly that this only once again confirmed that they needed to hurry. Otherwise they would all simply die lying down if the disease spread, and people then attacked again. The guard apologized to the elder for not thinking and said that he would gather everyone right away. The elder orc said that people will definitely pay for daring to raise a hand against their Red Feather clan. And the villain added that their heads would be impaled on pikes, and their entrails would be fed to beasts, and their intestines would be hung so that the orcs could see them rotting. And so 2 of the orcs patrolled the forest. Although they were in damn pain, they considered it cruel. Suddenly one of the monsters fell into a hole hidden by leaves. He shouted to his comrade that it was a trap. Scott decided that it was enough just to reduce the mobility of the orcs with the help of traps and poison, and the fallen monster was just injured by one of these daggers. The second orc shouted to his comrade to wait for his help. But at that moment Scott appeared behind him, and the enemy began to shout loudly that there was a man there. The orc swung his machete at the enemy, hoping to kill. But the guy calmly said that he was glad that they thought alike and also took out his sword. A fight broke out between the orc and the young man. Scott was trying to make sure he didn't have to fight everyone at once, since he had to kill 7 of them first. The young man thought that he could deal with 2 orcs if he used his confident gait as much as possible. But the guy didn't know what would happen if he ran out of mana, so Scott decided to arrange everything so that he could fight one-on-one. Thanks to this, a young man can fight an orc without using skills. Now the player, albeit not by much, is now stronger than the enemy. Activating his ability to walk confidently, Scott blows off the head of another monster. The orc's head falls from his shoulders and flies towards the pit from which the orc who had previously fallen had just appeared. The monster says that his comrades in the fortress will not just leave it like that. The guy invites the monster to bring his comrades here. The orc quickly runs to the village to convey information about the enemy to the elder. But the guy overtakes the monster and pierces him with a sword, because he was only required to show in which direction his tribe is located. The killed orc falls to the ground, and the guy stands behind him with a sword in his hand. The young man pulls out his lower fang. Scott was happy because he understood that now everything should go smoothly. The guy looked into the inventory. It was completely filled with weapons that had fallen from the orcs. The player collected only their fangs, since he did not know which part of them was the most valuable. Scott thought that as long as he has full mana, he can activate shock about 6 times and confident steps about 4 times. If he uses active skills, then fighting 2 orcs is not a problem. There are 14 pieces left before the quest is completed. If, after everything the guy has gone through, because of that black-haired girl, he doesn't get the bonus for the first passage, the young man decided to hurry up so that this doesn't happen. The cattle reached the village of infected orcs. The young man noticed that it was too quiet here. There was no patrol or security. The player realizes that the enemies cannot move due to illness. The guy noted that the orcs he fought with before also had red spots on their bodies, and these were apparently the ones who were even worse off. The thought flashed through Scott's head that he would finish the quest faster than he thought. The young man noticed that the enemies were not even resisting. The hero mentally called on the orc to wake up, because he had slaughtered his opponents in the starting room countless times. But the monster was in too much pain. He asked to be saved. The guy thought that although he was sorry, now the orc was just a piece of meat, so instant death would be his mercy. Without hesitation, the young man killed all his enemies in the settlement. Now the guy sat and thought that since he had killed 29 of them, then there was only one left, after which it would all be over. And then the young man heard the sounds of an orc. The enemies noticed traces of a man on the ground. The sergeant major ordered his subordinates to keep their eyes peeled. The young man did not notice their approach, as he was too focused. The head orc thought that a human had infiltrated their village while they were patrolling outside. The elder realized that his brain was not working properly due to illness, so he thought that it was worth leaving at least a few guards. The guy understood that if the orc elder had been healthy, he would have already realized that something was wrong just by the smell of blood in the shack. However, now he was just a sick orc. And so the elder falls into a trap set by the young man from the fishing line. He stumbles and falls to the ground. The elder notices a piece of torn fishing line that he tripped over. At the same moment, the guy strikes the monster and cuts off the orc's hand. But the enemy shouted to Scott not to underestimate him and activates a fire arrow. Several burning arrows flew straight at the young man. The guy activates a confident step. Using this skill, the player can anticipate the safest direction of movement, which from the outside can be mistaken for acrobatic stunts, all thanks to the fact that one can see the trajectory of high-class fire arrows. But the guy lost his balance due to lack of physical fitness and lack of experience. A fiery arrow hit Scott because the young man did not have time to turn away. The elder, pleased with his successful attack, asks how the young man is doing with his magic, and added that the guy will die in agony, devoured by the flames. But Scott tells the elder that, unfortunately, the guy has a cool passive ability. A blue system screen appeared, indicating that low-grade magic resistance had been activated. In a normal situation, the fire on the guy's shoulder would continue to cause damage, but thanks to magical resistance, the fire almost immediately dissolved into thin air. The elder tried to somehow object to the young man, but at the same moment the cattle beheaded the orc. The guards saw this and began to threaten the guy. The young man looked at his enemies with a cold gaze. At that moment a blue holographic screen of the system appeared. It announced the fulfillment of the condition for the destruction of the infected orcs and an offer to complete the quest. Scott gladly accepted the offer. The quest ended. The young man was transported in a second from the location with the orcs to the original city. For some time the monsters were perplexed at how quickly the man disappeared, and so the guy returned to the city. The system issued a message about completing the quest and rewards, among which was a reward for the first passage. The young man was glad that he was faster than that girl. The guy realized that the skill of Confident Gate was the most useful. Apparently, The effectiveness of this skill will increase as agility increases, so the young man will put additional characteristics into it. The young man decided to look at the rod that he received at the very end. It was the rod of the nameless orc elder, but it affected only 1% of the skill. The young man noted that this was not enough, but it was better than nothing. Suddenly Scott noticed his rival in the quest. The girl stood nearby and did not seem to notice the young man, and finally she noticed the guy. Their eyes met. Scott suspected that she was going through the same quest. The guy decided that it seemed he was still one step ahead. He had free time, so the young man wanted to take on another quest. Scott approached Sarah and asked to take a quest with rat monsters. The girl asked to send it right now, but the stranger heard the young man's conversation. She approached Sarah and also said that she would take a quest with rat monsters. The girl replied that she would immediately send her to destroy them. The young man notices that the girl is again completing the same quest as him, and so the stranger was moved to a location with rat monsters. Rat shouted at the girl and asked who she was, but the unknown woman, without saying a word, attacks the rat. The monster doesn't understand where the girl came from, so he realized that he couldn't handle it alone and it was better to retreat. But the stranger activated the ability of the flying sword. Rat felt the danger coming from the girl. The monster was about to flee, but the unknown woman strikes the enemy with her blade. The girl remembered seeing the rod that the guy was holding. She was sure that it belonged to the elder of the orcs, which means that this player completed the quest. The unknown woman understood that the young man was now at approximately the same level as her. The girl suggested that the stranger might be even stronger than her. Unlike Scott, the girl did not use traps, and moreover, did not kill weakened enemies, but fought 30 orcs face to face and won. Jacqueline was a magical swordsman. From the very beginning she had 3 skills: middle-class sword skill, flying sword art, vampirism technique. The girl was stronger than the special forces. Jacqueline thought that the guy couldn't be stronger than her, although it felt more rough than strong. Meanwhile, Scott was also fighting with monster rats. His ear itched, so the young man thought that someone was talking about him. The guy poured poison on the cheese, and that's how he got rid of the rats. The red-haired guy was surprised that Scott was able to collect so many werewolf fangs and hearts. He tried to ask how the player managed to do this, but the young man did not tell about his secrets. Scott couldn't shake the feeling that this was still not enough compared to that girl. Sarah noticed that although the young man finished everything quite quickly, the player who started the quest at the same time as him completed it faster. The guy realized that traps and poison were not enough to get through quickly. The non-player character seller Bruce was surprised that the young man spent 15 out of 23,000 gold on the purchased equipment. At first, there were some disagreements with the definition of these people as non-player characters, because the term itself was taken from games. But now people have come to terms with it. Since they were created by great entities, it is impossible to distinguish them from people, and each has their own unique personality. In addition, in the world of the mission there were many things similar to the game. Approximately 2 months had passed since it began, and just like in the games, people were divided into 3 classes. Those who had to sell even basic equipment to satisfy their hunger are the poor. Those who are either weak nor strong are the middle peasants. And the highest class consists of those whose talent is worthy of respect. They are considered rankers. A special class has also appeared, known as top rankers, but on average, each ranker has overwhelming power. One saleswoman asked Scott. Apparently the young man had finally collected the necessary amount to purchase skills. The young man asked her not to delay and give him a book of skills. The girl with a smile handed over the book that interested the guy. 500,000 gold for a mid-grade sword skill. A mid-class poison art for 30,000 gold. The total came out to 80,000 gold. The seller called the guy a stupid customer. The guy asked her again, but the girl immediately said that he had heard it and called him now an expensive customer. The young man thought that all this cost him 90% of all his savings. But now he can use the skill of the long sword. Is it possible to defeat the ranker Jacqueline with this? Not long ago, a girl beat him to the punch with a bonus for the first passage of the quest to explore the lunar landscape cave and sold Kyle a bonus item for the first passage. It was a long spear of the lunar landscape, for 2 million gold. Scott was upset that he was late again. Jacqueline noticed the drooping guy, and the young man decided to go through this quest again to try to catch up with his rival. Players gathered in the square, offering different things to the people. Some were selling a low-class iron sword, some were selling low-class magical samples, and some were even looking for a player to jointly complete a quest to hunt goblins. One man was looking for a partner who would agree to take on a quest with him to explore a cave in the lunar landscape, and Scott was just looking for such a person. The guy approached the unknown woman and asked what roles were still left for this quest. The girls said that they had places left for one warrior, archer, thief and mage. They lacked protection, so they would like to find a warrior. But then the girl noticed something that surprised her. The guy was wearing a worn raincoat and standard clothes. The clothes looked pretty clean, but were not of particularly high quality. The girl noticed that although the quest of exploring the cave of the lunar landscape is one of the easiest, she still asked the young man how experienced he was. The cattle showed the girl his characteristics without any problems. The sign of the soul was a kind of certificate that demonstrates personal characteristics. It cannot be faked, since it is issued for money in the Temple of Changing Professions. The stranger was surprised by the high level of indicators and other characteristics. She noted that the guy was at the level of a ranker, but Scott explained that the indicators simply increased due to receiving connections in quests, and he did not have normal equipment. The connection was a hidden item or an additional stat point that can sometimes be obtained by completing quests. The girl clarified Scott's name and introduced herself as Sandra. She noted that a person with his characteristics was more than enough for them, so she suggested they go right now. The young man laughed friendly and agreed, and Sandra said to follow her. The girl made a new quest comrade from the inn where the other members of the group were. She told everyone that she had brought a warrior, but the disgruntled boy John said that the cattle looked weak and called him the first one he met. But Sandra said that his strength was 50 and his agility 80. John immediately looked at the newcomer differently. He asked if he was a ranker. The girl explained that he was not a ranker, and his characteristics had increased thanks to the connection. John praised Sandra for her useful work for the team. John introduced himself to the young man in a normal manner, and Scott mentally summed up that the boy was not particularly polite, but also said his name. The guy decided that John was older than him, so he said that he would treat him with respect. The young man agreed and showed his axe. He added that he was a warrior. Scott tried to put on an admiring face, and said that the axe looked heavy, and its muscles screamed about its strength. John laughed lightheartedly and said that he was quite strong, and the young man mentally called him an idiot because his praise was sarcasm. The warrior said that the girl who brought Scott is an archer and her name is Sandra, but they already know each other. And next was the masked guy Lewis. He was a thief. Then John introduced Lady Allison. She was a magician and also a famous ranker. Scott immediately had a lot of questions about whether the girl was a foreigner, a ranker. He thought that there were only Koreans in this city. The girl herself approached the newcomer and said that she was glad to meet you and asked to call her Ellie. He replied that it was the same and also said his name. Even among rankers, mages are valued. This is due to the fact that becoming a mage is very difficult due to how much skill books cost. Scott began to reason that there were 2 people in the vanguard, including him, support and 2 more in the rearguard. The guy considered this risky. John said that exploring the lunar landscape cave is an easy quest, so it will only be worse if they call someone else, then they will have to divide the reward among themselves. Therefore, the warrior said that such a group is more than enough. But Scott understood that he was one of those who spread rumors about the simplicity of the quest. He also specially sold the map of the cave and the method of passage. Of course the guy needed a group. But their goals were different. Sarah moved to the location of the quest to explore the cave of the lunar landscape. A system message appeared with information about the task. Scott was about to take out his sword, but John calmed him down and said that monsters do not appear from the very beginning. Werewolves will only appear in the cave, so the guy can rest until then. The young man agreed with the warrior and silently hid the sword. The guy noted that the newcomers looked quite relaxed. Apparently they had already been here several times. But Scott drew attention to the ranker Ellie. The girl looked distant from the general group of people. But then John approached her. He invited Miss Ellie to take his hand. If she was scared, the girl became wary. But then Sandra crashed into the guy's side and hit the young man in the side with her elbow. The girl grabbed the guy by the hand and said that it was time for them to move out, and the warrior noted that it was painful. Scott realized that John and Sandra were dating. Then the newcomer turned his attention to the thief Lewis. That guy also avoided everyone, like Ellie. While the couple walked ahead and argued, Scott noticed that the mage ranker began to lag behind the group. The young man extended his hand to the girl, but said that she was fine. but the guy insisted on help, explaining that the slope was steep, so you should be careful, and since she was a magician, her endurance should not be very high. Ellie tried to object again, but the guy told her to grab her hand, because they were already behind. The girl nevertheless agreed and gave her hand to Scott. In fact, the young man thought that Ellie was very valuable, since she was a ranker, and also a magician, so he decided to make a good impression on her, especially since she was also an attractive girl. The cave of the lunar landscape is a place where unique minerals are mined, and since they sparkled in the darkness like stars, people described it as walking through the night sky. Suddenly, Lewis asked everyone to stop because with his trap detection skill, he discovered a trap. But Scott also saw her, thanks to his vision from the ability to detect middle-class traps. Lewis poured some liquid onto the rock where the trap was located. This substance dissolved the rock and a broken trap appeared from it. The thief said that now they could go. Scott thought that Lewis had a mid-class disarm skill, and maybe he had a mid-class trap detection. The guy thought that given the fact that almost everyone in the group was average or even weak, then the thief unexpectedly turned out to be not a weakling at all. So Scott decided to be wary. The young man did not forget about Ellie and asked if she was a ranker. The girl replied that she was not sure, but that's what those around her said. Scott called it incredible and added that the girl is really strong. Rez is a ranker, so he can't help but admire the top players. But the girl answered with a smile that she couldn't compare with them. Top rankers are higher than the sky, they are like people from another world. The two most famous rankers are Jacqueline with her magic sword, who completed the high-level quest to explore the lunar landscape cave alone, and the second ranker was Kyle. He had a high-rank spear mastery. The guy became even more famous thanks to the fame of the birth group he created, so Ellie was not sure that she could call herself a ranker. Scott told the girl that if ranker mages are rare, then isn't the girl the best of their mages? Ellie said that she was pleased with the young man's words, but she said that the guy overestimates her. Suddenly John shouted for everyone to run towards him because the werewolves were approaching, and then several ferocious werewolves appeared next to the group of players. Each hero prepared to attack the enemy with their special weapon, but John orders everyone not to attack the enemy, because he and Scott will sort it out. The young man mentally did not understand why this was. The guy didn't know if the warrior was doing this so that everyone would save their strength at the very beginning, or if he just wanted to show off. But the young man had to come to terms with it. And so John activated the crash skill. The warrior raised his huge axe and struck the ground with it. The shockwave sent blocks of stones onto the werewolves. One of the monsters growled loudly, but immediately Scott pointed his sword in front of his face. The guy offers the werewolf a one-on-one fight. The enemy immediately rushes to attack the young man. Scott understands that the werewolf's strength indicators are high, but he attacks predictably, and the radius is small. And since the hero invested most of the points in agility and increased strength, it became easier to dodge. The young man clenched his sword and prepared to strike a crushing blow to the enemy, and so the guy attacks the enemy with his huge sword. The werewolf barely managed to cover his muzzle with his paw. Sandra suggested that Scott was fighting at the level of rankers. He was just playing with this werewolf. Ellie agreed with her, but the guy himself understood that in this world you never know who will stick a knife in your back. So he decided to quickly finish with the werewolf, so as not to show his true strength, because the guy realized that he had unknowingly gotten carried away by this fight. Meanwhile, John activated the Crash Power Step skill, which instantly increased the guy's physical performance, increasing damage. The warrior deals a crushing blow to the werewolf. Having defeated the enemy, the guy began to brag about himself to everyone. But then John noticed that Scott had not finished his fight yet. The warrior irritably noticed that the young man was still fighting. In an instant, the guy cuts the second werewolf in half. The girls praised John and Scott for their excellent efforts, but the warrior replied that it was nothing, although it was clear from him that he was happy. But the warrior immediately turned to the newcomer and asked why he had been bothering with the werewolf for so long. But Scott replied that he had no active skills. After his words, everyone present was surprised. The players could not believe that the guy had not learned a single active skill. The new guy didn't have a single active skill. Everyone in the group of heroes was perplexed by these words. They asked how the guy could not learn a single active skill. All skills can be divided into two types. The first skills are active and are activated at will, and the second are passive and act constantly. Most people learn passive skills at a ratio of 3 to 7, but even if the active skill is of a low class, it still adds 30% to the damage of warriors. Everyone has at least 1 or 2 active skills. John asked the guy how this was possible, and why he did this. Scott apologized and said that he had other expenses, so he could not afford an active skill, and thanks to the connection, his characteristics were quite high. After listening to the newcomer, the warrior thought about his words. The guy noticed that the werewolf had several wounds, but they were definitely not fatal, so John noticed that Scott was bad in attack due to the fact that he did not have an active skill. The warrior was going to tell the guy everything he thought about him, but suddenly the young man fell silent. He thought that if it had been someone else, the guy would have driven him away from their teams long ago. But the guy has characteristics at the level of a ranker, and besides, the guy fights well. The warrior shouted, "No matter who," and said to move on, and Scott apologized again. The whole group continued further into the cave. John asked Sandra what she thought about the guy. The girl replied that if compared in terms of striking power, the warrior was superior to the newcomer. But overall, he's a cut above, which is why Sandra said that as long as he's alert, he can handle 4 werewolves alone. John drawled irritably and glanced at the swordsman. The cattle walked with their heads down. Suddenly, another werewolf appeared in front of the group of players. The monster growled throughout the cave and asked the people if they understood where they had come. Ellie summoned an ice spear. At the same moment, the ranker's magic attack struck the werewolf. Lewis joined the fight and threw daggers at the beast. The weapon stopped the attack of a huge werewolf. Sandra pulled the bowstring and shot an arrow at the enemy. The werewolf was defeated. He screamed loudly in pain. John said they don't have to worry if that's all the werewolves can do, so the players can go. Scott approached Lewis and said that he was incredible and asked about the rank of his dagger throw. But the thief answered surly that the guy shouldn't ask about that. The young man smiled and apologized, and then added that compared to the thief he had seen before, Lewis was on a completely different level. The thief calmly replied that he had a low rank, but in his free time he practiced. Then Scott asked John how difficult he planned to complete this quest. The warrior replied that they would leave immediately, as they fulfilled the adventurer's conditions, killing 20 werewolves. As a result, they would receive 100,000 gold and 5 skins. But the young man had other plans. He suggested to the warrior why not go through it at the butcher level, because everyone in the group is strong. However, John was very surprised by this proposal. Sandra said that it might be too difficult because they would have to kill the moon wolf and solve the mystery of the moonscape cave. But Scott did not back down. He asked if the reward divided by 5 on the adventurer's difficulty would be enough for those present, in which case they could take the quest of a lower rank. The warrior said that was true, but isn't it dangerous? Lewis joined the words of the newcomer, and said that there was no need to be careful. The thief added that Scott replaces 2 experienced warriors, and Mrs. Ellie has magical powers, so Lewis was also determined to take the quest to a higher level. But John still didn't like this idea, so he suggested sticking with the hunter difficulty. The thief immediately agreed, but offered something in return. After all, if they pass at the butcher level, he would receive 3 strengthening stones, so the guy will not be able to participate in their distribution. Scott thought that each such low-grade strengthening stone is currently valued at 100,000 gold. People do not refuse the reward just like that, so the young man assumed that the thief was up to something. The newcomer asked Lewis why he wanted to go through the butcher difficulty. The young man replied that, to be honest, this time he was trying to awaken for the first time. The thief explained that he wanted to change his profession to one that would be of a high class. But to do this he needed to complete the quest for this difficulty 3 times. John clarified that Lewis gave the reward to awaken and agreed to the butcher's conditions. The warrior added that the main thing for everyone is safety, so John instructs Scott to keep an eye on the monsters, and Ellie, if she feels danger, then spare no mana and attack. The warrior said that he had already completed the quest with Sandra on this difficulty, so they knew the right path. But the young man asked Lewis to make sure that he could disarm the traps. Having given instructions to everyone, the group leader announced the start, and everyone went. Scott noticed that Lewis did everything for him, because if the thief had not intervened, the guy would have had to do it himself, which means the thief will have his first awakening. Lewis attacked his enemies with his daggers. Sandra accurately shot from a bow at the enemies. The werewolves fell one after another, clearing the way forward for the heroes. John reports that after this the mid-boss of the moonscape cave should appear. The young man asked if anyone knew anything about the boss, The thief clarified that we were talking about a black werewolf. John agreed. The warrior began to think about a plan. As soon as they disarm the trap, a large flock will appear. 5 ordinary werewolves and 1 black one. They can easily cope with 5 ordinary ones, but the black one can become a problem. Lewis asked John how strong the black werewolf was. The guy replied that he was not sure, but in his experience that werewolf was equal to 3 ordinary ones combined. Scott intervened in the dialogue and announced to the young men that he would take on the werewolf. John thanked the guy for volunteering, but asked if he could. The newcomer said that he couldn't kill him, but if he just needed to restrain him, then yes. The warrior said that since he saw what the guy was capable of, he asked him to just be careful. Scott agreed. The guy continued that there were ordinary werewolves left. Even if John takes on 2, what should they do with the remaining 3? Because Lewis most likely will not cope against 3. Ellie came out to the guys and told them to leave it to her magic. The girl explained that she would kill one of them as soon as he appeared. Scott would distract the black werewolf, and John would deal with 2, and she, Sandra and Lewis would deal with the remaining 3. The guys approved of Ellie's plan. The newcomer mentally decided that it would definitely become easier for them if there were fewer enemies. After that, the girl squeezed the magic staff. Rancor activated her ability. The entire space around her was covered in flames of fire. Scott looked at her ability in surprise. Ellie formed a sphere of fire. All the players were shocked by what they saw. The girl launched a fireball directly at the enemy. The fiery flames struck the werewolves standing nearby. John ordered everyone to act according to plan. Sandra began to attack the enemy with her arrows. The cattle struck one of the werewolves. The guy carried the werewolf with him, wondering how many times it had been. A black werewolf, whom Scott had already seen earlier, appeared in front of him. The monster immediately attacked the young man, but Scott deftly dodged his attack. The guy decided to find the right moment, and so the young man activates the shock ability. The werewolf only managed to see the enemy approaching him. The young man strikes the monster with a crushing blow with his sword.